Welcome to Listifox, the Angel of Death. During World War II, in the Nazi concentration camps, one name stood out among the most ruthless and merciless: Josef Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death. Officially, he was a doctor. In reality, his actions were far from what is expected in the field of medicine. Mengele saw the prisoners of Auschwitz as disposable subjects for his experiments. His primary focus? Twins. He believed they held the key to unlocking genetic secrets and enhancing the so-called Aryan race. However, his methods were anything but scientific. Children were taken from their families and placed under his custody. Some were subjected to forced blood transfusions, chemical injections into their eyes in an attempt to change their color, and even surgeries without anesthesia. When one twin died, the other was immediately killed, so Mengele could perform post-mortem comparisons. Survivors' accounts paint a picture of absolute horror. To Mengele, these prisoners were not human beings. They were merely disposable test subjects. At the end of the war, he escaped justice, living in hiding for years. He eventually died without ever facing consequences for his crimes. The Aversion Project. In the late 20th century, a horrifying project was unfolding within South Africa's military facilities to cure homosexuality. What began as a so-called medical experiment quickly devolved into one of the cruelest chapters in the history of psychiatry, the Aversion Project. Between the 1970s and 1980s, South African soldiers who identified as, or were merely suspected of being, homosexual were forced to undergo rehabilitation treatments, a formal term for something far more sinister. These so-called therapies included electroshock treatments, psychiatric drugs, and even chemical castration. When these methods failed, the next step was even more extreme: irreversible surgeries, including forced gender reassignment procedures. Hundreds of young men were taken to cold, sterile rooms, sedated, and operated on without consent. They woke up later with no explanation of what had been done to them. For many, this shattered their identities, ruined their lives, and condemned them to a lifetime of psychological suffering. The project was shut down in 1989, but the scars it left behind can never be erased. Many survivors never fully recovered from the trauma, and worst of all, the perpetrators were never brought to justice. Unit 731, located in occupied Manchuria, this secret facility was nothing more than a torture lab disguised as a research center. What happened inside? Biological experiments and live surgeries without anesthesia on helpless prisoners. Soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army abducted Chinese civilians, Russians, and even American prisoners of war to serve as human test subjects. Or rather, marutas, a dehumanizing term that means logs of wood. That alone speaks volumes about how they were perceived. The methods were brutal. Some prisoners were tied up in freezing temperatures to study the effects of hypothermia, with their limbs submerged in ice-cold water until their bones cracked. Others had their organs surgically removed while still conscious, just so the so-called scientists could observe the effects of death in real time. And it did not stop there. Biological weapon experiments led to the deliberate release of deadly diseases such as bubonic plague, cholera, and anthrax, wiping out entire villages. Victims were intentionally infected and observed until death, with no attempts made to cure them. When World War II ended, those responsible for these experiments should have been tried for crimes against humanity. However, instead of facing justice, they were granted immunity in exchange for their research. The United States deemed the data collected too valuable to discard. As a result, not a single scientist from Unit 731 was ever brought to justice. Henrietta Lacks. Scientific advancements often come at a price. But what happens when that price is paid without the person's knowledge or consent? Henrietta Lacks never volunteered to change the course of medical history, yet her body was used for that very purpose without her permission. In 1951, Henrietta Lacks, a 31-year-old African-American woman, was diagnosed with cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins Hospital. During her treatment, samples of her cells were taken without her knowledge. What doctors discovered afterward was something never seen before: her cells did not die. While ordinary human cells died quickly outside the body, Henrietta's cells kept multiplying indefinitely. This made them a groundbreaking tool for science. Without her or her family's knowledge, her cells were distributed to laboratories around the world. The cell line, now known as HeLa, was used in vaccine development, cancer treatments, and even experiments for space travel. But while medicine advanced at her expense, her family remained in poverty, completely unaware that Henrietta's body was being exploited. Her medical records were released without permission, and her relatives were harassed into giving blood samples without any explanation. It was only decades later that the truth finally came to light. In 2023, more than 70 years after her death, Henrietta's family finally received financial compensation for the use of her cells. However, the debate over medical ethics and consent continues to this day. Project MKUltra, a top-secret experiment, hallucinogenic drug testing, psychological torture. It sounds like something out of a science fiction novel, but it was real. And the worst part? The United States government was behind it. Between the 1950s and 1970s, the CIA led a highly classified project known as MKUltra, a dark attempt to uncover methods of mind control. The agency believed that, with the right techniques, they could turn anyone into a programmable puppet, the perfect spy. The experiments were conducted on prisoners, psychiatric patients, and even ordinary citizens, all tricked into participating in something they never agreed to. Victims were forced to take high doses of LSD, subjected to hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and even electroshock therapy, all without their consent. The goal? To break the human mind and rebuild it from scratch. One of the most terrifying experiments took place in Canada, where a renowned psychiatrist, funded by the CIA, used postpartum depression patients as test subjects. They were kept sedated for weeks, while hypnotic recordings played on repeat in their ears. Many completely lost their sense of identity. Some were never the same again. The worst part? When the scandal came to light, the CIA destroyed almost all records of MKUltra, making it nearly impossible to hold anyone accountable. However, fragments of documents were uncovered in the 1970s, revealing that the United States government had used its own citizens as lab rats. Radioactive oatmeal. Breakfast is supposed to be the most important meal of the day, unless it comes with an extra ingredient no one told you about. Between 1946 and 1953, a bizarre and highly unethical experiment was conducted in the United States. The target? Children. At a facility called the Walter E. Fernald Developmental Center in Massachusetts, dozens of boys were tricked into joining its secret science club. What they did not know was that they were about to become human test subjects in a radiation experiment. The researchers, sponsored by MIT and the Quaker Oats Company, wanted to study how the human body absorbed radioactive nutrients. To do this, they served bowls of oatmeal contaminated with radioactive isotopes, without telling the children what they were consuming. The experiment was disguised as a harmless nutritional study, and the victims were even given rewards and incentives to participate. The radiation exposure was small, but the psychological impact and complete lack of ethics make this case truly disturbing. Neither the children nor their parents were ever informed. Their bodies were used for experiments without any form of consent. Decades later, in 1998, the victims finally received financial compensation from the government. But that does not erase the fact that vulnerable children were treated as live test subjects, all in the name of science. Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Imagine going to the doctor seeking help, only to unknowingly become a test subject in an experiment that lasts for decades. That is exactly what happened to 600 African American men in the state of Alabama, United States. The government offered free medical care, but what they actually received was one of the most cruel and deceptive studies in history. Launched in 1932 by the U.S. Public Health Service, the Tuskegee Syphilis Study had a disturbing goal: to observe how syphilis progressed in the human body when left untreated. To achieve this, 399 of the participants were already infected when the study began, but they were never told. The remaining 201 men served as a control group. The doctors lied, telling the men they were receiving treatment when, in reality, they were never given any effective medication. Not even in 1947, when penicillin was discovered as a cure for syphilis. For 40 years, researchers simply watched as the symptoms worsened. Patients developed paralysis, blindness, dementia, and eventually died, all without ever knowing they were deliberately being left to die. The scandal only came to light in 1972 when a whistleblower exposed the truth to the press. The study was immediately shut down, but the damage had already been done. Many participants had died, infected their wives, and even passed the disease on to their children. In 1997, 65 years after the study began, then-President Bill Clinton issued an official apology to the victims and their families. But one question remains: how many other similar experiments have never been uncovered? Radiation experiments in the USA. Between the 1940s and 1970s, during the Cold War, the United States government conducted a series of secret radiation experiments, all without the victims' consent. Civilians, soldiers, hospital patients, and even pregnant women were deliberately exposed to dangerous doses of radioactive material, all in the name of science and national defense. The experiments included direct plutonium injections, exposure to radioactive clouds, and even the administration of radioactive iodine to pregnant women to study its effects on the fetus. In one particularly shocking case, terminal cancer patients were injected with uranium without being told what they were receiving. Some died within months, while others developed severe health complications before their original illness could even progress. Thousands of people were affected. The worst part? None of them knew they were part of an experiment. They believed they were receiving standard medical treatments, when in reality, they were nothing more than test subjects in a secret study that treated radiation as a weapon of war. The details of these experiments only came to light in the 1990s, when declassified documents revealed the full extent of the project. But for many of the victims, it was already too late. Human vivisections by Herophilus. In the 3rd century BC, a Greek physician named Herophilus of Alexandria made discoveries that would shape the study of anatomy forever. He was the first to identify that the brain, not the heart, was the center of human thought. But how he obtained this knowledge? A nightmare straight out of the worst torture labs in history. Unlike other physicians of his time, who only dissected cadavers, Herophilus took it a step further. He performed vivisections on live human beings, meaning he cut open their bodies while they were still conscious and feeling everything. Condemned prisoners, deemed disposable by the government, were tied down and subjected to brutal procedures without anesthesia. He cut into muscles and observed how they reacted in real time. He examined internal organs while the patient was still struggling to breathe. In some cases, he removed his victims' eyes just to study their connection to the brain. All of this took place in front of his students, as if it were nothing more than a routine anatomy lesson. Historical accounts suggest that hundreds of prisoners were subjected to his experiments. While his discoveries contributed to modern medicine, the methods he used remain one of the greatest atrocities in the history of science. Surgery without anesthesia. In the 19th century, medicine was advancing rapidly, but there was one horrifying problem: effective anesthesia did not exist. Surgeries were performed on fully conscious patients who felt every cut, every incision, and every second of indescribable pain. Hospitals resembled true chambers of torture. Surgeons used crude saws and scalpels to amputate limbs as quickly as possible, not out of compassion, but because extreme pain and shock could kill the patient before the procedure was even completed. A skilled surgeon could amputate a leg in under a minute, but the survival rate still alarmingly low. Surgical rooms were filled with spectators, including medical students and curious onlookers eager to witness the spectacle of pain. Patients were tied to the operating table and forced to endure the agony. In many cases, the procedure ended with deafening screams and patients passing out from sheer pain. It was only in 1846 that modern anesthesia began to be used, with the first successful ether experiment. But until then, thousands of people endured the horror of feeling every cut, every stitch, and every procedure performed on their bodies without any relief. San Quentin Prison Experiments. Between 1913 and 1951, San Quentin Prison in California became a human laboratory. The man behind it? Dr. Leo Stanley, the prison's chief surgeon. He believed he could purify and strengthen prisoners through experimental medical procedures. But in reality, he turned these men into lab rats. The experiments included forced sterilizations, bizarre transplants, and even testing treatments for the Spanish flu, but the most disturbing of all was his quest for the fountain of youth. To achieve this, Stanley removed the testicles of executed prisoners and transplanted them into living inmates, believing this would increase their virility and turn them into better men. When the supply of human organs ran out, he began implanting testicles from goats and wild boars into prisoners. The procedures were performed without consent, and the victims had no choice. Any resistance could lead to even harsher punishments. Stanley genuinely believed he was doing something beneficial for humanity, but in reality, he was conducting one of the most unethical series of experiments in the history of the prison system. He retired without ever being held accountable, leaving behind a legacy of suffering and human rights violations. Soviet sleep deprivation experiments. The human body can endure hunger, pain, and even extreme temperatures. But what happens when sleep is forcibly taken away? What happens to the mind when it is no longer allowed to rest? During the Cold War, Soviet scientists sought to discover the limits of sleep deprivation. What is the goal? To create soldiers who did not need to sleep. But the experiment quickly turned into a living nightmare. The experiments were conducted on political prisoners, who were locked inside sealed rooms and exposed to an experimental gas designed to prevent them from sleeping. At first, the participants showed only signs of irritation and difficulty concentrating. But after a few days without rest, everything began to fall apart. The victims began to experience delusions, extreme paranoia, and violent outbursts. Some started tearing off their own skin, murmuring incoherent phrases. When the researchers finally decided to open the chamber after weeks of sleep deprivation, what they found was so horrifying that even the scientists themselves hesitated to continue. The survivors were emaciated, covered in open wounds, and trapped in a state of irreversible madness. When asked what they wanted, they gave only one chilling response: "Let us stay awake." Although it has never been fully proven, rumors suggest that the experiment was classified as top secret and that those responsible were never held accountable. Puerto Rico birth control trials. In the 1950s, American scientists were searching for a revolutionary solution: the first birth control pill. But before it could be released to the public, it needed to be tested. That was when women in Puerto Rico were chosen as involuntary test subjects in a brutal experiment. The drug used in the trials was 20 times stronger than modern birth control pills. The participants, many of whom lived in extreme poverty, were never informed of the risks. All they were told was that they were part of an innovative treatment. What followed was a disaster: constant vomiting, blood clots, unbearable pain, and even mysterious deaths. Even when the women reported severe symptoms, the researchers ignored their complaints. To them, the side effects were just statistics. The truth is, these women never had a choice. They were simply used as living experiments for a pharmaceutical industry driven by profit. The most terrifying part? Despite the deaths and severe side effects, the pill was approved and released to the market. The monster experiment. In 1939, psychologists at the University of Iowa conducted a bizarre study to understand the origins of stuttering. But instead of simply observing children who already had the condition, they decided to create it. The experiment involved 22 orphan children, who were divided into two groups. One group was praised and encouraged, while the other was repeatedly humiliated and corrected every time they tried to speak. They were told things like, "Stop talking like that," "You sound terrible," and "No one will ever understand you," even when they spoke normally. The result? Healthy children began developing symptoms of stuttering. Some stopped speaking entirely, becoming extremely anxious and withdrawn. The experience was so traumatizing that many of these children never regained normal speech for the rest of their lives. The study was never published, and the very scientists who conducted it tried to hide what they had done. The name, the monster experiment, did not come from them. It was given by the researchers themselves when they later realized the cruelty of their actions. Decades later, The survivors finally received compensation, but nothing could erase the psychological damage they had endured. Mustard gas experiments. During World War II, the United States and the United Kingdom conducted secret tests with mustard gas, one of the most devastating chemical weapons ever created. But instead of using volunteer test subjects or controlled methods, they chose to test the gas on their own soldiers. Young soldiers, many of them new recruits, were placed in sealed chambers and exposed to clouds of mustard gas without any protection. Some were forced to wear military uniforms to test how well the fabric resisted the toxin. But there was no real protection. They inhaled the gas, felt their skin burn, and their lungs inflame while scientists took notes from behind the glass. The symptoms were brutal: massive blisters covering the body, temporary blindness, and irreversible lung damage. Many soldiers suffered chemical burns so severe that they were permanently disfigured. The worst part? Most of them had no idea they were part of a chemical weapons test. And because the experiment was classified, the soldiers were forced to sign confidentiality agreements, preventing them from ever speaking about what had happened, under threat of losing their benefits or even facing imprisonment. The case only came to light decades later, but for many of the victims, it was already too late. The government took over 50 years to acknowledge what had been done, and to this day, many of those affected have never received justice. University of California experiments. In the 1960s, researchers at the University of California conducted a series of highly questionable experiments on newborn babies. What was the goal? To study blood flow and stress responses in infants. The method? Subjecting them to painful and invasive procedures without anesthesia. The study involved 113 newborn babies, all just a few days old. Some were tied to circumcision boards and placed upside down while scientists measured blood flow to their brains. Others were submerged in ice-cold water while catheters were inserted directly into their aorta, one of the heart's most crucial arteries. The babies cried, trembled, and suffered, but the doctors offered no relief. To them, these newborns were nothing more than data points in a medical study. The most terrifying part? The parents were never informed of the real risks. They believed their children were simply undergoing routine medical procedures. The details of this study were only revealed decades later, and to this day, it is remembered as one of the most disturbing examples of ethical failure in scientific research. Forced sterilization experiments. What if someone decided you did not deserve to have children? What if that decision was made without your consent, without your knowledge, and with no chance to resist? During the 20th century, Germany, the United States, and Sweden implemented forced sterilization programs, a brutal attempt to purify society by eliminating those deemed undesirable. What began as a eugenics theory quickly turned into medical experiments that destroyed thousands of lives. In the United States, between the 1920s and 1970s, more than 60,000 people were forcibly sterilized. Poor women, people with disabilities, and racial minorities were frequent targets. Many were institutionalized in psychiatric hospitals only to be sterilized without their knowledge. Some only found out years later, when they tried to conceive and realized that something had been done to their bodies without their permission. In Nazi Germany, the methods were even more brutal. As part of the Aryan race ideology, Nazi doctors forcibly sterilized over 400,000 people, often under grotesque conditions and without anesthesia. And in Sweden, between 1934 and 1976, around 63,000 people were forcibly sterilized, many of them young women who were deceived or coerced into undergoing surgery. The Swedish program claimed to be preventing social problems, but in reality, it was a gross violation of human rights that devastated thousands of lives. Decades later, some victims received compensation, but most lived their entire lives without ever seeing justice. Guatemala Syphilis Study. Between 1946 and 1948, more than 1,500 Guatemalan citizens were deliberately infected with syphilis and gonorrhea without their consent in a secret study funded by the United States. The man behind it? John Charles Cutler, the same doctor responsible for the infamous Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The targets of this inhumane experiment included prisoners, soldiers, farm workers, and even orphans. Some were forcibly injected with the diseases, while others were tricked into sexual encounters with infected prostitutes. The doctors aimed to study disease transmission and test the effectiveness of penicillin. But the study quickly turned into a medical atrocity. Many of those infected never received treatment, left to suffer the devastating effects of syphilis and gonorrhea, dementia, open sores, unbearable pain, and, in many cases, death. The research was hidden for decades, until 2010, when the truth finally came to light. The United States government publicly admitted to the experiment and issued an official apology. However, no compensation was ever offered to the victims or their families.